Hey guys, Sarah here. So today I'm going to be doing another very requested morph video about corn snake hypotypes. A lot of people have been wanting me to do something on hypotypes because there's a lot of them and they're all very confusing. I'm going to be going over the list, which I have made here on this little tiny whiteboard, because this is kind of an extensive list. I'm going to try to go through it relatively quickly, which means I'm probably not going to go through all of the histories of every single one, but I'm going to kind of go through descriptions of each one and how you might be able to tell the difference between that and other hypotypes and stuff like that. I do have a friend here with me in this container, and we'll be getting her out a little bit later on, and I'll try to use her to sort of help compare and contrast between different morphs. So before I continue, I do want to say that all this information is in my first corn snake morph book, and it is available on my website, sarahsnakeshop.com. I'll put a link down below, and go ahead and use code HYPO1 and check out to get $3 off any book that you purchase on my website. I know that I push the books a lot, but I think that if people would read the information that I have in there, it would be a lot more simple because I've already written the majority of this information down, and I know a video is a lot more fun to watch and stuff, so I'm happy to do that for you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump into this. So here's the list. I'm sorry if my light's kind of reflecting. So I have a typical and atypical. I have, well, not atypical and atypical, but typical hypotypes and atypical hypotypes. And essentially what I mean by that is the typical hypotypes are types that only affect the color of the snake and nothing else, whereas the atypical will affect both color and pattern. So here, I'm gonna scoot over, try to get it so you guys can see it a little better. Okay, so we're going to start with the very first one, hypo type A. Now, for most of you probably know this, but hypo is short for hypomelanistic, and essentially if you break the word down, hypo means a lacking of or less than, whereas like hyper is the opposite, and that means more than or in excess of. And then melanistic is like melanin, which is the dark color in the skin. Humans really only have melanin. That's really the only pigment that we have. So like a hypomelanistic human would be like a ginger, for example. So if you have the ginger gene, you are kind of a hypomelanistic in that your skin's going to be lighter, your hair is going to be lighter, stuff like that. So that's essentially what hypomelanism is. But in corn snakes, it only affects the one color, the black. So I'm going to go ahead and get my friend out here. Her name is Miranda. She is an ultramel, and she is a good example of a hypotype. For those of you who have ever seen a normal corn snake, you know that their belly checkers are black and their borders are also black. And as you can see by her, hers are actually gray. And in some cases, they're going to be more of like a tan in a hypotype, and in some hypotypes, they're going to be more of like a purple color, and we'll get over that. But I wanted to show you an example of a hypotype so you kind of get an idea of that versus a normal. Remember that the normal, where this gray is on the outsides of the orange and where the gray is on her checkers, a normal, those are going to be black. They're going to be jet black. And on pretty much any morph that is not a hypomelanistic type, those are going to be black. Now, there obviously are types like amelanistic types, which means completely lacking in melanin, but that's a whole different video. I'll go ahead and put that in a card above. I did do a whole video on different amelanistic types, so you guys can go check that out and hopefully learn a bit more about all the different amel types as well. And when I say different amel types, that video goes over the different morphs that are considered amel. So candy cane is amel, and so is sunglow. Those are two amel types, but those are just two different selectively bred morphs of the same gene, whereas the hypotypes that we're going over are all different like genes. They're not selectively bred types of the same gene. So it's a slightly different video, but it's similar enough. Okay, so hypotype A is pretty much your standard. It's going to have the same amount of like every other color as a normal would, but the black is just going to be faded, usually to more of a tan, sometimes to a gray. It's not going to be very bold. Usually hypomelanistic A types also have thinner saddle borders. That's just sort of the way it ends up. So if you ever see a snake that it kind of looks normal, but it also kind of looks lighter than a normal, it's probably a hypo type. There's a lot of different kinds of normal types that we'll go over in a future video. There's like Miami and Okatee and stuff like that. I'll go over that in a different video so you can learn to tell the difference between those. But as far as hypo types go, if you see a snake that the belly checkers are gray and there's no real black anywhere, it's probably a hypo type A. If it looks like a normal, just a little bit lighter. Now, strawberry is actually considered hypotype B, but we consider it strawberry because it's like, we named it that because they are a little bit pinker. So hypotype A will sometimes make the reds in a corn snake almost a little more like orangey or not quite as bold. And that's usually just because that's another place that it sort of takes the melanin away, and it just makes that whole area seem a little bit lighter. Strawberry doesn't seem to take quite as much of the melanin away in those areas, so it kind of allows that to stay pinker, which is why it's called strawberry. Now, originally, strawberry was thought to even add pink, and I think that we've learned from breeding trials and stuff like that, a lot of different people who have worked with strawberry does not actually add any pink to corn snakes as they originally thought. The reason that they thought that was because a lot of their strawberry lines were actually carrying a red factor gene. And I went over red factor versus red coat and red factor versus hypo in 2 other videos that I will also put in a card above for you guys to go check out if you're interested. So strawberry, just in general, if you're breeding it, kind of treat it as more of just a regular hypo type that may retain a few more pinks here and there as opposed to your typical hypo. Christmas, which is hypotype C, is another hypotype that actually for a while was thought maybe to not even exist. A lot of people are still up in the air about whether it's actually a whole different gene or if it is just a sort of counterpart, it's a selectively bred type of either strawberry or hypo A. And the reason that they think that is because hypo and strawberry are actually allelic to each other, which means they share a locus, they share a place on the DNA. I will eventually have a genetics video on that, the allelic genes, pretty soon. I actually plan on making that video tomorrow, so once that video is up and going, I will also link it in a card as well, so that you guys can go and understand the relationship that those genes have with each other. But Christmas also has that same relationship with hypo and strawberry. It shares a locus with them. It shares an allele, essentially. So, or it's allelic. That's the term that we typically use for the recessive genes that share a locus. So Christmas, since it was so sort of, there's so few of them, and there were there wasn't much to go off of. A lot of people kind of thought that maybe the gene didn't even exist and thought that it was just a selectively bred form of hypo, or maybe it was just a hypo plus red factor or something. Like, nobody really knew what Christmas was. However, more recently, my friend Laura from Wind Serpents, I know I've mentioned her a few times, I will link her website down below if you want to check her out. She has a lot of really quality animals. If you're wanting to get a corn snake, she has some amazing corn snakes, and I'm sure that if she hasn't hatched any yet, she will hatch some very soon. She's also getting into a few different pythons and stuff, so again, I'll try to link her thing down below so you can check her out. But she had got some Christmas hypos not too long ago, and she was talking to me about how her Christmas hypos were actually much pinker than her typical hypotypes. And when she mixed it with snow and other things like that, they actually were a lot more pink. So since the jury is still sort of out on Christmas on exactly how it works or what it does, I'm not going to go into too much more detail because we're still sort of in the breeding trials on that. There's actually one more I need to add on here that I forgot, and one of my friends is going to yell at me, I'm sure. There's the last one on the bottom. Sorry about that. I had to add it on there. I just remembered it. So back to Christmas. Christmas may actually kind of either not take away as much red, or it might add a little bit of pink. So the jury's still out on that. We're still doing breeding trials, and we will definitely get there when the time comes. and I will try to make a video in the future on Christmas specifically and how it relates to everything once we know a little bit more about it. So I'm going to move on to Ultra. Now, I showed you my little friend Miranda. She's not happy about being in this container. Don't worry, she has breathy holes. Don't worry about that. Now, Ultra is usually a lot more yellow. It's usually a lot brighter. And the Ultra's colors are usually very much a gray, almost a purple color. You're not going to usually find a very red Ultra. Most Ultras are going to be more yellow. And that's because the Ultra gene actually originated, they believe, in another type of rat snake. And it's a hybrid gene, sort of like how Scalus is kind of considered a hybrid gene as well. Not exactly the same, but similar in that way. Ultras are usually, like I said, they're more yellow, they're more brightly colored. If you see a corn snake that is really, really brightly colored like she is, and it's a hypo type for sure, there's a really good chance that you have an Ultra, especially if it's much more like orange and yellow and not as much red. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one, Lava. Lava and Ultra actually look very similar, especially when Ultra is mixed with Amel. Now, Ultra and Amel, I'm not going to go too much into this, but they are allelic with each other also. So if you mix Ultra and Amel, you get Ultramel, like Miranda here. And the Ultramels and Lavas look very similar because they both have ruby pupils. Ultra by itself does not usually have ruby pupils, at least not in adulthood. However, sometimes they do, and sometimes Ultramels will lose the ruby pupil into adulthood. So since they look so similar and they reduce the melanin in a very similar way, and they can retain the very thick saddle borders, both Lava and Ultra can retain the thick saddle borders where typically Hypo, Strawberry, and Christmas do not. Typically Hypo, Strawberry, and Christmas do not retain thicker saddle borders even when they're bred into Okatee lines. It's usually reduced at least some, but Ultra and Lava both can retain those thick saddle borders, so they're often confused for each other quite a lot. Lava, however, usually reduces melanin even more than Ultra does, even when Ultra is mixed with Amel. So when you see a Lava, a lot of times their saddle borders will be more of a purple color. Like, it'll be so reduced that you can't even tell that it was supposed to be black at any point. It looks more purple. Sometimes you'll get some that are a little darker, but that's just natural variation. And Lavas are also usually a lot more red than Ultramels. You saw Miranda, she's very orange and yellow. Lavas are typically going to be much more red. Sometimes they'll get a little bit of an orangey tint to them, but Lavas are going to be a more red version of a Hypo, especially compared to Ultra. I'm going to move on to Dilute. Dilute is kind of a weird one because it's not very common, but essentially Dilutes kind of look like, it looks like all of the colors on them have just been faded. It kind of looks like a Dilute is like in blue all the time. Like, it looks like it's in shed all the time. You look at it and you wonder, are you going to shed any day? Because it looks like you're going to shed any day. But that's just their coloration. So a Dilute is Hypo. It could potentially go in the atypical because it doesn't just reduce melanin, it kind of reduces all of the colors a little bit. But since I kind of split up the typical versus atypical in pattern versus color, like pattern versus just color anyway, then I figured Dilute would probably go into the typical section just as well. So if you see a snake that sort of like looks like it's in shed all the time, that's kind of what a Dilute looks like. If you mix Dilute with Anery, it almost looks like it has kind of like a pixelated look to it. The blue is what Dilute plus Anery is called, and when you mix Dilute with other morphs such as lavender and things like that, it really has a very unique look to it where it really does look like the melanin, the places where there is still melanin, especially the darker patches, they look like pixels on a computer. It's a very interesting look, but as soon as you kind of get an eye for it, you see that those pixels and you think, oh yeah, that's Dilute. That's what Dilute does when it's mixed with Anery, or when it's mixed with lavender, or when it's mixed with charcoal. It for some reason, in my mind, they look like computer pixels, and that's the best way I can describe it. We're going to move on to Castagna. Castagna is one of those really weird ones that sometimes they're really dark and they still can maintain their typical melanin, but most of the time they don't. And there's a lot of different forms of Castagna. I'll go over that in another video at some point if you want me to do a deep dive on that. That's where you're going to get your like your coppers and javas and other morphs like that. And I might even include like Orange Thing and Sunrise in there, and there's some other. Castagna is kind of a weird one. It just, in general, there's a lot of different types of sort of Castagna morphs. It's like in a Castagna complex. So, but the Castagna gene in general, it's originally, it's the German word for chestnut, and they really do have a very chestnutty color where they're almost more of a brown when they're babies as opposed to like a normal, which normals are also kind of brown, but these are like a lighter brown. It's very hard for me to describe. It's almost like, see the color of my hair? I actually colored my hair today to this reddish, light reddish color. And honestly, that's sort of the color a Castagna is going to be. Like they get this weird like reddish to brown like hue to them. Like, for some reason, my hair reminds me of Castagna, and you know you've been doing corn snakes too long when you're like, my hair color looks like a corn snake. But that is how I consider it, is like, their heads are usually more red, and then as you get down to the tail, they're more brown. And they have a very, very interesting color fade. And normally you can pick them out by their eyes. So if you hatch, even if you hatch, like, let's say normals and Castagnas in one clutch, those Castagnas, they just have those bright red irises from the day they hatch. And even when they're young, their irises are like red. But then they, like, as they color up, they're always kind of this weird red-brown color. And if you guys have ever seen like either gopher snakes or bull snakes, the way that the color fades from the head to the tail is very Castagna-like. So I highly recommend kind of looking up like gopher snakes especially, and looking at how that color fades from the head to the tail. That's kind of how a Castagna's color fades, from the head being very red to the tail being a weird like dark brownish weird color. Like the Castagnas are just a very interesting gene. They don't stick out like a sore thumb, but when you can see the difference between those and normals and those and other hypos, they really have a beauty about them that you just don't see in a lot of other morphs, at least not in my opinion. The next one I'm going to go through is het palmetto. I kind of accidentally scratched that off, but it's het palmetto. I also almost put this in the atypical because of the way that it's not, it's a heterozygous version instead of a homozygous version like the majority of these. But I figured, as far as visually, since we're going with like these will alter the pattern as well and these only alter the color, I figured I would stick this in here. Het palmettos really do look like a slightly lighter version of a normal. And they also tend to have sort of a silver kind of silver lining, I want to say, along their sides just above the belly. And it's not always going to be 100%. Like, you can't just look at a snake and be like, oh yeah, like that's a het palmetto. But if you have, say, if you have a het palmetto and you breed it to a normal and you get normal babies, there's a good chance you're going to be able to pick out the ones that, the 50% of them that ended up carrying that palmetto gene, because they will be a little bit lighter in color, slightly hypomelanistic, with a little bit more silver around the edges, like along the edge of the belly on the sides. So het palmetto, even though it's kind of, it's more of like an honorable mention hypo, it still is hypomelanistic. It's just not as like obvious of one, and not one you're probably going to run into on a daily basis. I did want to talk about peach. That was the one I added on here. My friend Terry House, I'm going to link her information down below. She's from Genetically Morph Reptiles. She's been doing a lot of stuff on peach for a long time now, and she's pretty sure that it's an incomplete dominant mutation, and it pretty much, it is hypomelanistic. It reduces the blacks to more of a red-brown color, and then it also sort of alters, it kind of like adds this weird like peachy tone to the ground color of the snake, and sometimes to the saddles as well. There's still a lot of breeding projects going on with that. We're still trying to figure out if it definitely is incomplete dominant, or if it's recessive, or what's going on with it. We're still trying to figure it all out, but it is one that I definitely wanted to mention because very, very soon here, I want to say within the next couple of years, it's probably going to be proven as incomplete dominant. Hopefully, we're crossing fingers that's what it is. And it's going to be one that a lot of people are going to be working with, and a lot of people have been working with it already and they just didn't know it. So the peach line lavenders that a lot of you have probably heard of, that's the gene that we're talking about, is what causes that like pinky, peachy, yellowy color in lavenders. They've isolated it and they're working on figuring out exactly how it works. All right, I'm moving on to the atypical now that we're almost at 20 minutes. Sorry about that, guys. There's a lot of hypos to go through. So Sun-Kissed is the first one in the atypicals that I want to go over. Sun-Kissed actually have a very, very varied color scheme to them. They change the pattern in that they will usually kind of give this weird head pattern that kind of looks like mask. For those of you who know what mask looks like, it reduces the head pattern so it's sort of isolated, and it usually brightens up the color. There's usually a lot more yellow on Sun-Kissed than there are on typical hypo, and it sort of rounds out the saddles. For a lot of you, you can kind of see, I think she's getting ready to shed there. Her saddles are pretty much squared off everywhere, but a Sun-Kissed has sort of a rounded saddle. All the saddles are sort of rounded off, and they look a little atypical. And then their bellies are going to be very similar in color to the Ultramel. Like the checkers and the black is going to usually be reduced about as much as it would in an Ultra or Ultramel. But sometimes, and this is another atypical thing about Sun-Kissed, sometimes you get a normal colored Sun-Kissed that is only visible in the pattern and not visible in the coloring at all. Sun-Kissed is kind of a weird one. I'm not sure if there's probably going to be breeding trials in the future on, is this normal colored Sun-Kissed its own kind of gene, or is it something that's selectively bred for, or is it only random? There's probably going to be people who are going to work on that. So far, though, I don't know of any for sure like definitive projects that are being done on that, or whether or not a normal colored Sun-Kissed is even something that we can predict. Okay, Mask is the next one I want to go over. Mask is one that was originally considered to be het diffused. So if you see a lot of old documentation, you might be like, oh, this is my het diffused, and I know because of the pattern. Mask is actually a hypomelanistic that also reduces the pattern a little bit. So when the snake is in utero, its pattern and color develop from the top down, from the spine down. And essentially what Mask does is it slows this process so that the color, the color doesn't, it'll make it to the belly, but it may not make it all the way to the center of the belly. So you'll often see masks that have a white line down the middle, and then the checkers are lined up on the edges. And this also prevents the saddle borders from being very thick at all. So you might see a lot of masks that just they don't have any saddle borders, they're almost borderless, or if they do have saddle borders, they're very thin, very small, hard to see, usually brown, and the belly checkers are also usually a dark brown or a dark gray as well. And then the head pattern is sort of isolated usually from the rest of the pattern on the neck as well, because of that slowing of the color and pattern being, in the egg. Sorry, I can't talk today. I'm moving on to lavender. For those of you who watch my lavender video, I will also link it up above in a card. Lavender is technically a hypomelanistic mutation that is a scale mutation. I know that a lot of people have considered it a color mutation, and if you watch my lavender video, you'll understand what I mean when I say it's a scale mutation. But lavenders, as you may know, are a kind of lavender color, but when you strip away the scales, they are actually just a typical looking hypomelanistic underneath. It's actually the mutation lavender mostly happens in the scales and not in the skin. So I'm putting that in the atypical, even though it doesn't technically alter the pattern. It's definitely a weird one, kind of in its own area, but it definitely does reduce the melanin to like a gray instead of it being the typical black. So I wanted to go ahead and add it on this list. I hope that that video helped you. I'm sorry that it's almost 25 minutes long. Like I said, I'm gonna put a link in the description below where you can get a copy of my first book and the second book if you want it for $3 off. And if you guys want me to do another morph deep dive in the future, specifically on like Castagna or other morphs, let me know in the comments. And if there's anything in this list that you were still confused about or you'd like me to answer, put that down in the comments below too, and I will try to answer those questions as well. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you in the next video.